Great. It's an opportunity to be here and present my ideas to people who are interested. So thank you for coming. I've been living out in the highlands of Brazil for about 10 years now. So it's been a while since I've been in front of an academic audience. It's good. The dogs and chickens don't give me much feedback. When I was asked to give this talk about healing and modern human dilemmas, I thought a lot about all the different ways in which I could speak to how shamanic practices could be used. But what I also realized was that we really have to understand what shamanic practices are. And if we understand what they basically are, then we all can go look for the myriad applications that can exist for using these ancient wisdoms and innate aspects of human nature. So most of what I'm going to talk about today is what shamanism was. And really at the end just use one example about how shamanic principles are being used today. So you can go forth and think about the ways in which you'd like to apply these patterns of human healing that have been around for perhaps 1 million years or a little more to the kinds of conditions that humans face today. So I'm going to start off just with a brief overview of what I want to talk about. I want to speak to the notion that there are universals of shamanism that can be derived from cross-cultural approaches. And I'll just briefly talk about the cross-cultural approaches I've used, but I'm not going to cover them today. I will emphasize that what the cross-cultural approaches tell us about shamanism is that it involves ritual, it involves alterations of consciousness, it involves interaction with what are perceived as spirits, and it involves healing. And that these aspects of ritual, alter states, and the spirit world interaction are key to these healing processes. And I want to propose that these involve some basic psychobiological aspects of human nature. And I'll talk about ritual in terms of its relationship to the ancient communication and communal integration patterns of chimpanzees. Not make the explicit connection, but that's where it comes from. A pattern of dynamics that integrate communities through making lots of noise together, making impressive performances, making conspicuous displays. And I'll talk about the alter states as a natural shift in human consciousness, one that I'll think will tie in very well with the ideas that John had about intuition, namely that we are using alter states to destabilize the frontal cortex and the default mode network so the ancient brains can have their say, they can speak. And I would propose that what's been discussed here in terms of insight is basically bringing to consciousness the processes of the ancient brain, much in the same way as when you wake up in the morning, you might say, what was that dream last night? Try to bring those images back into your conscious space. And the spirits, I'm going to propose that whatever they may ultimately be, we can understand them as mechanisms for organizing our own consciousness. When we talk about spirit possession or incorporation of spirits or the ancestors or any other number of dimensions that are spiritual, ultimately I think we're using a language that can be mapped onto neurophysiology and once again the cognitive processes of the ancient brain. I will spend a bit of time talking about what I view as the bases of shamanistic therapies, how it is that alter states of consciousness provide therapeutic mechanisms, how it is that the dynamics of ritual produce therapeutic mechanisms through eliciting, among other processes, our own innate endogenous endorphin systems. We have mechanisms that involve social interaction that stimulate how our bodies make us feel good. And we'll see that ritual is the ancient tools for making people feel better by using processes that stimulate our body's ability to produce endorphins. And I'll talk about spirits as a process of therapeutic engagement in which we take things that we perceive, vaguely understand, and project in a way that allows us to turn back and look at ourselves and act upon what it is that we perceive about ourselves. Whatever spirits may be, they function in societies all over the world as a psychological system for making sense of these inchoate, unconscious, implicit, innate processes by which we come to organize our perceptions of the world. And now I'll wrap up today with just a few thoughts about how it is that shamanism and its concepts can be applied to address contemporary healthcare problems. And I'll focus on the notion of addictions and substance abuse treatment as a perfect area in which shamanic principles can and have been applied to successfully move people's consciousness from the closed kinds of conscious experience characteristic of addiction to the more expansive, embracing senses of self and other. That's part of the recovery process, and how shamanism always viewed the world, viewed us as being intimately integrated with other kinds of beings and forms of life that enable us to have more power, more strength by incorporating the sense of others into who we are. So when AA says you have to accept this higher power, the shaman would have said, hey, how about accepting this power animal? Work with you and do you a lot of good. So the modern world gives us a slightly different view. Most of these ideas I have incorporated into this book here that really looks at how this biopsychosocial paradigm played out in the course of human evolution. How it was that we became a healing species. And it lays the seeds of my thought about how shamanism played a role in the evolution of human society, human communities, human healing capacity, and the human ability to produce cognitive niches, produce conceptual frameworks within which we integrate others, integrate the physical world, integrate the natural world into a world that we understand. You don't want to buy the book. Most of this you can find some articles on my webpage, or go to researchgate.net. I've got about 60, 80 articles there that address shamanism and healing and the application of these principles to the treatment of addictions. So, what is a shaman? I mean, today the word has been so widely appropriated and misapplied that people almost legitimately say there really is no such thing as shamanism. It's just something that's invented, made up, conceptualized by Westerners with their misunderstandings of the other. I don't think that's true. And I think if we start from Eliade's classic definition, we'll be able to ultimately trace out what I would call the neurophysiological, neurophenomenological foundations of a whole wide range of practices found around the world. Eliade characterized the shaman, and I've kind of paraphrased him here, someone who enters ecstasy to communicate with the spirits on behalf of the community. And here I think we have three pillars of what I would claim to be the foundations for understanding shamanism. The notion that we enter an alteration of consciousness, that there is an interaction with what we conceive of as spirits, and it's done on behalf of a group of people with co-participation in the process. So it's a nighttime ceremony of singing, drumming, and dancing, and in a sense storytelling, myth-telling, in which alteration of consciousness is produced, typified in the case of the shaman's alteration, as an out-of-body experience, a soul flight, a magical flight, this sense in which our sense of who we are separates from what we know to be our body and moves into an experiential space in which we experience other worlds. I won't say a whole lot about that, but I think that this speaks to the notion of a fundamental transformation of consciousness that's available to people all over the world. You can't find a society in which some people don't report some sense of an alteration of consciousness in which we separate from the body. Why? Because it's inherent to our nature, and I'll try to give you a little bit of understanding why. In the shaman's case, it was used to work with animal allies that were the sources of power, and I'll at least introduce the idea that these notions of animals are a kind of psychological system that's innate to human beings. Everybody intuitively understands the difference between being a mouse and being a lion, okay? Or being a bird and being a toad. Although toad's getting a much better reputation these days. So animal allies become these metaphor systems I'll talk about later that can be used for healing, for transforming consciousness. If someone says, go over there and act like a mouse, you're going to be very different than if they say, I want you to be a roaring lion over in the corner. That it evokes a kind of power and sense of self that can be used to transform how it is that people experience the world. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. This was sort of Eliade's concept, and I put it to test, as it were. I did my dissertation a number of decades ago, in which I took a cross-cultural sample based on ethnographies, did formal coding of data, statistical analysis, and came out with empirical categories. And so I can say, yes, shamanism is not just a figment of the Western imagination. It's not a postmodern creation. Those things may have happened, But shamanism has a deep root in human nature, and you will have found, past, in foraging societies all around the world, the same basic patterns of behavior. So to me, this is a noumena. It's something that's not based upon our perceptions or wishes or projections. It's something out there to be discovered, understood, and ultimately explained. And I've tried to do that in neurophysiological and evolutionary terms. So I'll start with the technologies. As John pointed out, a lot of shamanic technologies are designed to disrupt the way we ordinarily experience the world. Fasting, induction of pain, staying up for long periods of time, drumming, chanting, and singing, and drumming, and chanting, and singing, and drumming, and chanting, and singing, often overnight, all night long, to the shaman collapses. And that's when the out-of-body experience takes over. They use a lot of different forms of sensory stimulation, not just the drumming and chanting, but the dancing and often other forms of noise production, heat, cold extremes, and psychedelic and other drugs. We could go through the neurophysiological research that would show that pretty much all of these things have been found to disrupt the higher control centers of the brain, prefrontal cortex and the default mode network. So we're breaking down the way that our brain experiences the world in ordinary social reality, ordinary social relations. So universals of shamans, the collective rituals, the drumming and dancing, fasting and sacred medicines, alterations of consciousness, visionary experiences, soul flight, death and rebirth experiences, relationships with animals, and transformation of identity. The shaman did all of these different things in foraging societies all around the world. And many times they were called other kinds of words, obviously. The Num Kausi of the Kung Bushmen. You can find, Page is widely used in South America. You find cognates with shaman throughout much of Paleo-Eurasia. But the name is not important. What is important is what they do. And the similarity across cultures tells us that the name that we pick, shaman, by virtue of history, is a legitimate term to use to refer to people who engage in all of these kinds of things. Notably here, this probably doesn't fit your grandmother, it doesn't fit a medium, it doesn't fit a diviner, it doesn't fit a meditator, it doesn't fit a lot of other kinds of practitioners who have been called shamans. They may have some of these elements, but the whole dynamic starts to disappear once agriculture takes over society and priesthoods emerge. So what I see in the context of shamanic practices is the elicitation of a variety of endogenous healing responses, which is to say, things that your body ordinarily does as a consequence of its innate processes. For instance, the use of ritual. What does ritual do? Go ask a primatologist and say, well, ritual is communication. Ritual is what integrates a group. Ritual is how you maintain the dominance hierarchy without violence. Ritual is how you provide a mechanism for bringing the whole group together at the end of the day. And what we know about this kind of process of bringing the group together is that it enhances the elicitation of our opioid bonding systems. That basically the same mechanisms that bond mammalian mothers and their offspring, whether they're dogs or cats or humans or monkeys, can be elicited through ritual. And in particular, song and dance are now known to elicit the endogenous opioid system. So whether it's, listening or dancing with the music or clapping with the music, interacting with people with the music, when you do that, your endogenous opioid levels go up. Why? Because that's our nature. We feel better when we're connected to people who are like us. We are very social beings. And so evolution took the mechanism that kept mommies and babies together and said, here's how we extend it to keep the group together. It's called exaptation. I'm going to talk about the alterations of consciousness as healing processes. And I'll spend a little more time on some of them than others, but at the basic level, it's physiological in the sense that what I see is the underlying feature of the shamanic alteration of consciousness is that you push the body to its extreme till it collapses. It's a sympathetic excitation to the point it's like, I can't do this anymore. Boom, and you have this rebound response, and the body goes into this extreme parasympathetic relaxation state. Benson talked about this as the relaxation response, and he thought it was intrinsic to a lot of healing processes. Your body doesn't heal when it's stressed. But if you go into a deep parasympathetic state, you enter into the kinds of modes of consciousness in which the body automatically begins to engage in the recuperative processes. As long as you're up and running around, you don't get over the flu. You got to go to bed. You got to give the body time to rest. You got to put it in that spaced out zone so that all these internal processes can get the energy to heal your body. So this would be the beginning of the physiology of the healing response. I'm ultimately going to develop this into an understanding of the relationship to the vagal response, which is to say we have this nerve system running from the base of our pelvis all the way up into our throat. And it's tied in with these evolutionary developments of the opioid bonding system. And it allows us to use ritual to manipulate where it is that the vagal system is going to be. Is it going to be in this panic, fright, frozen mode? Is it going to be in the fight or flight response mode? Or is it going to be in this social bonding mode in which you're comfortable with the social context in which you're in and the endogenous opioids start to flow? So ritual is a tool, I think, that allows us to move not just individuals but whole groups along the process of coming out of the fight or flight response and moving into a context in which our whole bodies can relax, because the total relationship, the powerful others, the relaxation intersect to produce this kind of well-being. I'm just going to say some things about the placebo and hypnotic effects, but not now because I'm going to get some detail later. And ultimately I'm going to contend that what's underlying these alterations of consciousness is what I've called the integrative mode of consciousness. I became a little disenamored with the idea of altered states of consciousness because there's so many of them. And not all of them particularly are, related to what we conceive of as shamanic and shamanic altered states of consciousness, mystical altered states of consciousness. But what I started to see is that all these physiological processes that are evoked by the drumming and the dancing and the chanting and the singing are basically elevating our ancient brain processes by destabilizing the frontal brain, the prefrontal cortex in the default mode. It allows the brain's natural impulses to emerge. And what this is basically theta waves, 3 to 6 cycle per second waves that propagate up the neuraxis of the brain. You can discuss it in terms of the cortical, striatal, thalamic, cortical loops, or in terms of the hippocampal septal system. But basically it's a nerve network that comes from the bottom of the brain and heads everything up and pushes all this information from our ancient brain structures into the frontal cortex. And this phenomena, or this process, helps explain a lot of the phenomena that people experience, because it's the uncontrolled brain, it's the random brain, it's the highly entropic brain that's pushing all of its information up into the ordered frontal brain that no longer is capable of coping with it because it's just too much information. And I'll talk about the spirit world in terms of archetypal psychosocial processes. I think that animals ultimately become, in the shaman's world, the most important forces and powers, and they are because they speak to something about our innate psychology. The animals and the spirit world really is a way of talking about how it is that our brains have become structured through not only their innate dispositions, but through socialization, and how it is that we've come to understand the world by using metaphors to express what we perceive. When your roommate, partner gets up in the morning and they're all grumpy, and you say, "Why are you such a bear?" They don't say, "I'm not such a bear." They go, we intuitively understand that we have captured something about how their emotional nature is being expressed. And I think that if we put the spirit world in the context of a set of metaphors for understanding these less easily perceived aspects of our own self, we have a tool to then understand how it is that shamanic practices work through the manipulation of mythologies and the beings and the entities to produce transformations that end up creating healing. So I just want to go over this briefly because I don't want to run through time real quick here. But I think the foundations of shamanism come from primate displays. And the chimpanzees have very well developed group chanting, drumming, and yes, dancing activities. I'm willing to bet that chimpanzees spend more time bipedal when they're doing ritual than anything else. They do rituals bipedally. I mean, typified in the case of the gorilla goes charging bipedally, right? He gets back down and walks off on all fours to go eat. So this is a display that has a variety of different impacts upon the other members of the group. But it's basically understood as the mechanisms for integrating the group. That by using the display mechanisms to show dominance, allowing the other members to show submissiveness, the group reintegrates itself without the necessary, interactions one-on-one or violent confrontations. So ritual among animals elicits the endogenous opiate responses in their own bodies. Things as simple as grooming, for instance, will elicit the opioid response. And the community rituals that shamans developed were basically an expansion of these social coordination processes. And when I said earlier in the talk that I think this goes back at least 1 million years, maybe closer to 2 million, it's because what I see as fundamental to the transitional developments was the capacity of mimesis, the expansion of the mirror neuron system as a tool for communication. So when we think about the way in which the shaman engages in the performance, does this theatrical kind of display, it has ties on one hand to the costly displays that are intimidation devices among many primates, and on the other hand, a mechanism by which emotions and feelings and ideas are communicated through the behavior of the body. And I think mimesis is the undeveloped aspect of shamanic practice, but some of my recent articles have looked at this and tried to tie it, for instance, to why are raves so popular today. I think it's tapping into some of these basic underlying structures of our neuropsychology. So, a biogenetic basis of shamanism would then be in the paleomammalian brain processes, where group emotional coordination is achieved by commingling. Everybody gets together at the rave, we're all listening to the same beat, and you just smile at someone across the room and you feel connected with everybody. And it's not just the ecstasy, okay? It's part of our innate nature to feel connected with others in this kind of context. And it has, impacts upon stress. It, induces our sense of relaxation, and ultimately brings the vagal system into this bonding mode, the puppy piles of raves, right? So our social attachment processes are fundamental to what is being elicited by ritual and what the paleomammalian brain does. And in this sense, by engaging in this kind of behavior, we're allowing the body to induce its own healing responses by amplifying the endogenous opioid system, and as a consequence, enhancing the capacity of our immune system. So you start to ask, how is it that a ritual is going to help my pneumonia? Well, I don't recommend you dance the whole ritual, but if the contact, the social bonding enhances your own endogenous opioid system, bingo, that's one of the most important inputs into the whole immunological response. Since I know I'm getting way behind time here, I'm going to skip over some of these stuff. The placebo effects and ritual healing. This is something that I've only briefly touched on in the shamanism book, and I hope to expand it in the future. But it's the idea that placebo and ritual healing and hypnotic susceptibility are all part of a package of adaptations that are derived from some very ancient dynamics that are managed by ritual processes. And this is the dynamics of dominance and submission. Now, we don't pay too much attention to that on a day-to-day basis as modern humans. We tend to try to live in equality, but the simple reality is, in primate groups, the dominance hierarchy are key to the group for so many reasons. Dominance hierarchies are the way that you stop fights. Okay. one animal only has to look at two animals that are facing off, and if they're both subordinate to him, it's like, okay, they back off. You don't have to have confrontations in a group if dominance is accepted as a principle of social organization. And ritual is how this is played out. Now, what's the importance of this? Is that when submission is a submission to a compassionate dominance, when the dominant figure is not oppressive, but comes across as a protector, then it elicits this whole cascade of emotional responses. The little kid that falls down and scrapes his knee, just wants mommy's hug, and then go back out. A little compassionate dominance resets our system, can be well. So this is part of what I think is the foundations from which these ancient primate rituals evolved into more complex processes in which the emerging dynamics of the acceptance of another induces the endogenous opioid response, facilitates the placebo effects, and contributes to hypnotic susceptibility. This takes us on another dimension here, which has to do with the dissociation from trauma, which is part of why we are also so susceptible to hypnotic kinds of suggestion, because we evolved to be able to tolerate people who weren't compassionate in their dominance. And still, through the dissociative processes, be able to be comfortable with them until the next blow-up. So dissociation figures in here in terms of an ability to move into the reality that other people propose for us. And I think that what the shaman does is create this other social reality. You're all heading for the trees. The tigers and the lions are out of the bush. You wonder if somebody's going to get eaten tonight, and the alpha chimp is down there banging on the buttress and screaming and yelling and banging branches on the trees and making so much noise that most lions and tigers are like, let's go find somebody who's asleep. Not going to mess with the big noisy dude here. So this social reality that's created through ritual enables us to manipulate the social emotions of an entire group. And of course, some of you may have already realized that this may be the ancient prototype for the rock star. That is why rock stars, inspire. The music's got to be good too, but there were lots of bad musicians who were well-loved rock stars. It's the performance. It's the alpha dude up there giving the kind of energy that I'm on top of the world, and you can chill. It's going to be okay. In the case of the altered states of consciousness, though, that emerge from the placebo and hypnotic effects, we have this internal engagement that then enhances our capacity to manipulate our own physiological responses, which is to say, by going into this withdrawn internal state in which we have this positive expectations about the world because of the dramatic performance, our bodies go into the relaxation response, enter into the the vagal resting mode, and stimulate the release of the endogenous opioid systems that have all these feed-forward effects into our immune system, reduction of stress response, etc. So, focusing on the altered states of consciousness. What is clear is that there's lots of different, just 5 more minutes. Okay.
You may be upset. You may be upset.
When did I start? I don't know, we ran late with, anyway, you want me to just do 5 more minutes, then we'll just do 5 more minutes. Altered states of consciousness can be induced by lots of different things, and what they do is produce these theta waves that activate the ancient levels of our brain and allow us to integrate this ancient level of knowledge. I call it a mode of consciousness because this is what the brain does from drumming or chanting or singing or meditation or fasting. All kinds of things will push the brain into this mode. It's significant for healing in part because it integrates the different levels of the brain. So where does intuition come from? It's our ancient brain system getting a chance to talk to us. So by inducing this slow wave synchronization, we're integrating brainstem, limbic brain, frontal cortex, We also get interhemispheric connectivity. That certainly would be another major source of intuition when our right brain, that's normally not dominating our consciousness during the everyday activities, is getting some information across. But it turns out the corpus callosum doesn't continuously transmit information. It like batches it every 15 or 20 minutes. Okay? But the altered states make it more continuous. You're getting constant transfer right to left, and of course the right is the conduit for bringing information up from the lower brain structures. So ultimately I think that what's happening is we're getting a synthesis of the behavioral brain, the emotional brain, with our thinking brain. So we can talk about general therapeutic effects of shamanic practice, the relaxation response, stress reduction, access to the unconscious. Freud thought that healing had to go through the unconscious. We had to bring all this repressed information up into consciousness to be able to process it more effectively. It turns out that very profound alterations of consciousness will extinguish learning processes. Concept of transmarginal inhibition, by pushing the brain and the body to a hyper-aroused state and collapsing it through fatigue or stress. It wipes out a lot of conditioned responses. So you can change how you come to feel and learn to behave by engaging in altered states. Certainly it gives us the opportunity to deal with a very rich information source, our visual capacity manifested in dreams, manifested in visionary experiences, manifested in intuition, where an image provides a sense of an understanding of something that wasn't conceptualized before. Mentioned many times the opioid release that comes from not only the drumming and the clapping and all this, but just being with people that support us. I can't go into it now, but there's serotonergic modulation, moderation of the serotonergic system, and release of the dopaminergic system that comes about as a consequence of shamanic alterations of consciousness. And the enhancement of neuroimmunological effects. Article I wrote many years ago was the beginning of my thinking about spirits as neurognostic structures. The idea that what we conceive of as spirits is really just something about how it is that our brain operates that has been adaptive for a variety of different reasons. And I can't go into all of these here, but the idea that we have a lot of different innate modular structures for mind reading and self-representation, and for representation of animals, and for perception of the selves of others, and for internalizing the moral evaluations of other social members. These are all part of our innate structures of our brain. And shamanism liberates these and uses them to try to help us understand our own impulses. So if I tell you that you're an aggressive and kind of an asshole because you have an overactive amygdala because you were traumatized by fright when you were a child, okay, it makes sense. But you can't explain that to someone 100,000 years ago when we didn't even know we had amygdalas. You got an angry bear spirit, okay? Oh, okay, yeah, everybody knows that. And now we're going to have to learn how to feed the bear so it doesn't get so angry. Okay, now the problem is modelable. Or you're a wimp, They're getting ready to dress you as a badarsh because you don't want to go out and fight along with the other men, Well, it turns out that all you got as a spirit is a mouse spirit, okay? So now we're going to give you the bear spirit, Here's the little bear, and remember the other guy with the bear? That's you. Okay, so it's a modeling process in which our innate psychological structures can be easily transferred into a known structure, the animal world. So alterations of consciousness have these implications for the modern world as medicines because they produce adaptive cognitive states related to the information of integration from our ancient brain. The visions that are often key to what shamans do are really a natural symbol system. Anybody that studies dreams are not going to tell you it's just a bunch of random images. No, these are symbols that tell you what's going on in your emotional and social life. So this is probably the original symbol system of humanity, way before language, and that shamans learn to exploit to enhance the integration of unconscious processes, just like a therapist does by using dream recall. So I think one of the cores of shamanic contribution to our modern world is to take us back and have us recover a pre-verbal symbolic system. We were highly complex symbolic beings before we were capable of complex language. Not only mimesis, but other forms of social understanding. Provide us with information, our visions provide us with information related to that. They're integrative processes. A picture is worth 1,000 words. This is one flash, one image. You can take that and process it, disarticulate it, understand the relationships, put it back together and say, okay, this is what I received. This is what the spirits gave to me. That just came out of your unconscious. And conversely, it can be used to control biological mechanisms. Images are very powerful evocations of emotions. And so the shaman uses the evocation of images through dancing, imitation, pantomime, mythology, other elements to recreate a certain set of expectations for you to internalize based upon the performance. So, to wrap it up here, diseases of civilization, therapies for trauma and abuse. Clearly we've seen some of the so-called psychedelics, MDMA being used for this these days. There's now increasing evidence that shamanic practices can also be used for trauma. And it turns out a lot of people like the clapping part. It's like beating the trauma out of your body. And ultimately I think we'll come to understand something about the power of the vibrational impacts in erasing memories. I think that's where it's ultimately going to go. But that drumming things out, dancing things out, is not just a metaphor. I think ultimately it's going to reflect physiological processes. Treatment-resistant depression, I would point to the recent studies on the use of psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, one of the classic shamanic tools, and I haven't gone there much today on the psychedelics, but certainly those have to be considered some of the most important shamanic tools to bring into the present world. And then the context of addictions and harm reduction. How is it that our changing our consciousness through ritual can help address addictions? So, the psychosocial dynamics of addiction is the loss of transcendent technologies. We don't have ecstatic religions very often anymore. Most of it's, Catholics and Methodists and Episcopalians and Presbyterians, you don't very often get to use the drums and the gongs and the cymbals and the bells during church service, okay? We don't have that anymore. We don't have community integration. We live in societies in which, we've become more multicultural, more culturally pluralistic, but, the things that take us together as a community of people beyond those separations of ethnicity are not really well developed. We know we're supposed to be tolerant of other people, but we don't have the mechanisms to integrate us. And the addicts sort of exemplify people that are just lost in society. They don't have community relations, they don't have community ties. The few they had to start with were burned in the process of becoming addicts. I think it's fair to say there's a major loss of spirituality, collectively and individually. And we don't have a society that easily leads us along a path of spirituality, as opposed to being a member of a religion or a church, which we should not confuse with spirituality. And we have a society today in which our identities are mixed. We have a lot of trouble figuring out who it is that we want to be. If you're 40 or 50 and above, your job may not exist anymore. And if you're, younger, what you just learned 20 years ago in college is like, new kids out, already got, a whole generation ahead of you on technology. Where you were working, they were learning the new stuff. We don't have a society in which we easily can shift our identities to new kinds of ways of being. And there's a lot of ways in which we have serotonin imbalances, opioid imbalances in our body. And Victor here was just leading me on to understand more about these blue lights here. Now I understand why they're so weird and what they mess us up. So, shaman gives us a treatment here, collective ritual activity. Bring people together in a ritual, they leave feeling more connected. Something about participating in ritual, communicating at the level of the body, communicating through mimesis, we become more connected with others, and this leads us into all these endogenous opioid enhancement processes. Shamanism provides technologies for self-transformation. You acquire an animal power, or certain influences can be removed from you. And you acquire a new sense of self-awareness. Most people moving into the process of shamanic development develop some sense of something that we would call a spiritual self, whether it's through the out-of-body experiences, whether it's through power animals, whether it's through experience of animal transformation. And ultimately, shamanism provides a death and rebirth experience as a core element, which is to say, we can let who we were go. Let it die. That person is gone. And things such as, the loss of conditioned responses that happen through the powerful altered states of consciousness can be key to losing those acquired behaviors that are part of the addictive dynamics. And there's many ways in which the alterations of consciousness restore both serotonin and dopamine, the opioids, but it's beyond what I can do today. So let me see here. Let's jump to the conclusions here. We have an evolved psychology that involves ritual healing. When I came to these conclusions about 30 years ago, it's like, we were born to participate in collective rituals in which we stay up late at night, take things to alter our consciousness, sing, dance, and drum, It's like, where does that happen today? And it's like, oh shoot, man, it's the bar scene, We really lost our way somewhere along the way, So we need these kinds of, activities. And hopefully in the near future, adolescents will be guided towards a good rave, rather than say, don't you ever go to one of those things. It's part of our development and emotional bonding. Ritual transforms and integrates consciousness. I think consciousness is partially misunderstood as an individual phenomenon. Consciousness is knowing with, consciencia. So consciousness emerges out of a connection with others. And this is what enables us to be conscious of ourselves. The baby figures out what it is by looking at others. It can't see most of its body to start with, but it develops a body map and a body sense in interaction with other people. And the mimetic capacities of infants are directly tied to the mother-child interaction. Rituals have physiological effects. People say, it's just a ritual. Well, maybe your ritual is just a ritual. Mine is not just a ritual. You're going to go somewhere. Something is going to happen to you. It's going to move where you are. And this is what I think is important about ritual. It allows us to change physiologically, socially, and emotionally our nature in ways that can be persistent, if not eventually permanent. And then we have the core transformative powers of the sacred medicines, the so-called psychedelics. So if I had really picked what I talked about today, I would have come to talk to you about my recently released book, Advances in Psychedelic Medicine. It's about clinical research into using what were the core tools of shamans, things such as psilocybin, in more recent epochs, things such as ayahuasca, but basically using tools that modify consciousness in very powerful ways and induce healing responses through a pharmacological manipulation of the body. Shamans also figured ways to do it without the psychedelics. But when we look at the evidence today for how quickly these things act, we can see why they were the preferred medicines of shamans. And I'll just close with one example. Treatment-resistant depression. People who have been on SSRIs for a decade or more, and it just seems every time there's a new med for them to try, they just get worse. And now there's studies out that, one dose of psilocybin can have, lasting effects, 6 months or more. That it doesn't take a whole lot of psychotherapy, it just takes retooling our nervous system. You might say, but why use the psilocybin? Why not just use a shamanic ritual? Well, Stanislav Grof put it really eloquently one time. He says, with 6 months of psychedelic therapy, you can pack 10 years of psychodynamic therapy. 6 months, you can accelerate the processes that much. So I say drum, chant, and sing at your ceremonies, and take a little mushrooms on the side.